cosmic storm. Floating on whimsical wavelengths is the norm. Dancing through the stars, chasing spectrums of light. Riding the waves that are just out of sight.
It's Whimsical Wavelengths, and I'm your host, Dr. Jeffrey Zurich, volcanologist and geophysicist, and it's also been 2 weeks. That's why I'm back in your ears with a treat. Today, we're going to look at the whole thing. What thing? The modern scientific apparatus itself, the institutions, the funding, and the historical policy shifts that built the world we live in. On this show, I've taken some historical romps through the planets, Nikola Tesla, the rise and fall of leaded gasoline, thanks to the grit of Dr. Claire Patterson. Usually, it's just me and my deep dives into the literature and history, but today, I have guests. People who have spent a lot more time than I thinking about the sociology of research. We're going to map out how we built a golden age of science and why I think that system is currently being selectively demolished. To set the scene, the year is 1941 and the U.S. enters World War II. Almost immediately, the government realizes that winning isn't just about manpower. It's about a race to solve impossible problems. We're talking code breaking to neutralize U-boats, the birth of rocketry, and of course, the Manhattan Project. This was the moment science shifted from the pursuit of the gentleman inventor to a pillar of national security. The Manhattan Project brought together thousands of young scientists, from chemistry to physics and everywhere else, all working on the same goal from different angles. They were building caltrons for uranium enrichment and using cyclotrons to break through the limits of engineering. This big science model gave way to the space race, the internet, and, of course, the modern university. But before I get too ahead of myself and attempt, it's time to bring in the real reason you tuned in. Today I have two guests, Dr. Ina Ganguly and Dr. Chris Fisher. Dr. Ina Ganguly is a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and studies labor economics and the economics of science and innovation. Dr. Chris Fisher is the founder and principal at Multivalent Communications. Chris is also a chemical biologist, scientific communicator, and science advocate operating at the intersection of science and society. Thank you both for coming onto the show. I have Dr. Ina Ganguly and Dr. Chris Fisher.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm just so glad you guys are here. I mean, I reached out via LinkedIn to Chris and kind of over months, this has kind of come and become cobbled together. But before we jump in with just 2 feet, I have a question for each of you to just learn a little bit more about you before we get to the main background topic. Chris, you went from a PhD to founding Multivalent Communications. Mm-hmm. What was that transition? I ask because in some disciplines, these conversations just don't happen. It's like we don't talk about the fact that you might not make it as a researcher or something, that there isn't like this other world beyond the academic tower.
Yeah.
So what about that transition from the lab to industry?
Yeah, no, first I'll just say I appreciate you commenting on that fact that, I think graduate programs are getting better about this, but for a long time, the focus was everyone here is trying to become a postdoc and then become a professor. And the reality is that less than 10% of them will. So we have to make sure that we're preparing scientists to enter other roles, whether it's industry roles, whether it's communications, business development, governmental roles. So anyways, it's good to make sure that we appropriately discuss that. So in terms of my journey, I'd like to think that I've always been multivalent. Really, since the beginning, I've had a strong interest in both science and in communication. I was that really chatty kid that always wanted to talk about everything, whether it was bugs in the grass or if it was a comic book. I was really interested in trying to share my thoughts with others. So I did years of performing arts. I did a minor in English. And I also have a genuine love of fiction, although you can't see it behind me. I've got a ton of fiction in addition to the science. I've got a bunch of comics as well. So I see those sort of two worlds as being a major part of who I am. But as I started my PhD, I didn't necessarily know how I could connect the two and make it into a career path that would be unique to me. But during my PhD, where I was studying how pathogens they often make use of multivalent, here we go, underlined, interactions to find their hosts, I realized that there was an aspect of science and research that I really gravitated towards, which is reading and synthesizing scientific information, making sense of what was being put in front of me, and then finding new ways to communicate that with others so that I could do maybe a new assay, maybe a new line of research. And then I found myself looking forward to like my weekly cafe time. And that was really where I did a lot of that reading, writing, and design work. And once I made that realization that like, oh, wow, like I'm doing the bench work so that I can go back to reading and writing, I went out of my way to try to find opportunities where I could really build that muscle. And for me, it started with science advocacy, in part because this was a great place to make use of scientific understanding, as well as the ability to communicate with others and use those skills together to form persuasive arguments that supported something that I really care about, which is the scientific enterprise. So after completing my PhD, I went full bore into that. I started doing freelance science writing for local startups in the San Diego area, and then spun that work and my advocacy work into a job at a life science communication and marketing agency. And after years of both working in agency life and in in-house roles developing scientific strategies and content, I decided I'm going to go out on my own. I'll start my own scientific and medical communications agency. And I haven't looked back since I started Multivalent Communications now, almost 2.5 years ago. So, and just as a little bit of context, I spend my time helping companies, organizations, teams, and individuals articulate their science and thereby provide oxygen for really, really important work. My focus is really on mediating information exchange across important boundaries at the intersection of science and society, from diagnostic companies, devices, pharma, to biotech, reagent, instruments, and chemicals companies. So that's me.
Wow. I mean, I guess that comes back to something somebody else told me. PhD is just a piece of paper. It's like a driver's license. It's up to you to what to do with it. And so you've built a very interesting career from something that some people might say is like stuck in the lab, but you're kind of broadening it out in a multivalent way to the rest of us.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I think as part of that realization, it occurred to me that, sure, the data collection, the bench work is the bedrock of science and how we ultimately push new innovations forward. But it doesn't really work on its own, right? The classic idiom of if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound, I think holds true there. And I felt like this was an opportunity for me to use my skills that I had been developing, all the while, to have a little bit more impact in science. I think I was a decent bench scientist, but I think I'm a much better communicator.
And that's why you're here on the podcast.
Here I am.
You've spent a significant amount of time as a Fulbright scholar, policy specialist in places like Ukraine, Russia, Tajikistan. Is there like any unexpected piece of evidence or history that just completely changed the way you view how science or labor functions compared to the West? And then relatedly, have you ever wanted a time machine to just go back and like poke at it a little bit more?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I have to say, it was really interesting to hear about Chris's journey. So I'm a labor economist, and I actually study scientists. And so, really interested in careers and choices that people make and how that contributes to scientific progress. And so, as you mentioned, Jeff, I spent time in some interesting places. And my dissertation was actually about science after the end of the Soviet Union. And I used a lot of data in my work, so publication data. And I was looking at the impact of grants during this economic crisis. But one thing that was really cool that economists usually don't do enough of, I think, is going into the field and interviewing scientists. And so I was interviewing scientists in actually 5 different former Soviet republics. And so it was really interesting because I got to talk with people who were working during the Soviet Union. And I do wish, I wish I had a time machine, but actually spending time in these countries, I actually got a sense of how things worked. And so, clearly, as you said, there are a lot of differences in how science functioned, I think, in the Soviet Union and then, the post-Soviet countries, post-Soviet period. But, some of the big differences, it was more of an institute-based research system, less kind of, scientist-oriented, less autonomy. Research was separated from teaching. But I actually think what I learned from that experience was how similar actually scientists are in many ways, in many places. And so it, got me thinking about, Robert Merton was a famous sociologist, and he talked about kind of these Mertonian norms of science. So there are things that are kind of universal about truth-seeking and also scientific collaboration. And so one thing that kind of sticks with me that happened is I was in Tajikistan. And I was in Dushanbe, and had an interview with an astronomer, kind of an older, Tajik astronomer who was working during the Soviet period. And turns out, I guess Tajikistan, I'm not an astronomer, of course, but turns out Tajikistan has good conditions for viewing, for astronomers. And so I think a lot of people from around the Soviet Union used to come to Tajikistan. And coincidentally, just prior to that, I had talked to a Ukrainian astronomer in Kharkiv, which is in eastern Ukraine. And somehow when I was talking to this Tajik astronomer, it came up that I had met with him. And he said, "Oh, wow, you met him? We used to work together a lot, like such good memories." And you just saw his face, lit up. And I think this idea that, they had collaborated, and this kind of, idea of, doing the science was something that, you see here when people are, kind of talking about the work they do and their collaborators. Now, something that I took away from that too is that, we'll get into this, is that, science and scientific communities are also very fragile. And so, it took decades, right, for the Soviet Union to build the institutions around science, create those collaborations, the science they were doing. But then, relatively quickly, it was all destroyed. And so those two hadn't seen each other in something like 30 years, they said at the time. And so, I think this idea that there is this fragility. So, I think, if I had a time machine, I would love to go even further back. But yeah, unfortunately, so far, we don't have one.
Yeah, I think it's always important to have people that can turn the lens back on us as scientists because, I think it's obvious. I tried to do that a little bit with the podcast. But do you ever find any pushback from the scientific community as part of this, just out of curiosity?
Pushback. I think the other thing is, people also like to be studied, right? And so, and I think, it's fascinating. We learn so much, again, most of the work that economists who work in this area of economics of science innovation, we work a lot with data, but really kind of talking to people and understanding what are you experiencing? That's what really drives, our hypotheses and, kind of how we can understand the data. But I think, the methods that we use are different. And, each field has its own methods, right, and approaches. And so I'd say the pushback sometimes is when we go to data, we might try to say something, general or patterns that we observe in the data. But a lot of times people get pulled back to their own experience and they'll say, "Oh, but for me, it wasn't like that," right? Like I didn't find that I wanted to stay in the lab and do, work. And so my experience is really what you should be finding. But, we try to kind of use our methods and data to try to make more general statements. So I think that's a bit of the pushback. But I think, I think it's been really great that I've had so many scientists who've been willing to talk and help us understand these issues.
I think part of what you said reminded me of the fact that there's a tendency to think about science and scientists as like purely the output, like the papers, the data, maybe the products. But there are people here, right? And as you said, like that's part of what makes the community fragile is it depends on these people being present all the time. It's not just when they publish something. And those relationships are important. It's also really important, as I'm sure we'll talk about later, how interactions with the public should manifest or could maybe support a better future for science.
Right.
Okay, time to turn the lens on the actual topic we're here to discuss, which is the whole system that we have today. But we need to start somewhere. Some other of my episodes I've started with something like the Black Death or the Roman Empire when I'm going into the whole historical side of things. But I think today we're going to start somewhere around World War II. You guys get to take it wherever you want because you guys are the experts. It's not me. So let's set the stage. What was the overall state of science and how was it conducted before World War II? Was it philanthropy like Tycho Brahe with a pet elk in a quadrant, or was it state-controlled and self-funded?
Yeah, just to start here, it really changed through time. So originally, as you look at the scientific revolution and beforehand, a lot of it was patron-based. Maybe that was folks in court. Maybe that was wealthy individuals, as well as what is often referred to as sort of gentleman science, which means an individually wealthy person is interested in scientific pursuits. They do their own research. They self-fund. They publish. As we progress through time, we see the foundation of the first scientific societies. We see the university kind of come into picture as another place to do this work. And as we get closer to the 19th and 20th century, the universities as well as religious institutions are funding more and more work. So there are like learned positions, there are endowments now that can fund some of the work. So really, it's not until we see the German state in the 19th century that we get more governmental interaction and more governmental funding of work. There is some throughout time, but it didn't really become a more primary operational tool until we get closer to modern history. And certainly, as we'll talk about, that really changed drastically in the 20th century, certainly in and around World War II, but beforehand as well.
Well, was there anything different from across the world? Were there different individual like systems set up, or were they all kind of the same? Because some of what you said was more about European centric, with the church representing the kind of the scientific establishment. But it was that the same in, say, the budding Soviet Empire, or I guess that would have been the czars back then?
It's a fair question. I would say, at least from my experience and talking about this time period, much of the academic and research activity is coming out of Great Britain, and it's coming out of Germany as well. So certainly there are other places where this work is being done. I mean, there are already Nobel laureates in the 19th century that are coming from Spain and other places in Europe. But I do think that there is a pretty strong like Eurocentric perspective at this point. Not to say that there wasn't research being done elsewhere as well.
Anything to add?
We'll get into it, but, Germany, as, Chris said, was really kind of where, kind of a height of, where science was happening. And then we'll see how that changed. I mean, we can talk about it maybe, but, then things changed with after World War II, obviously. But yeah, Great Britain, and Russia, Russian Empire also. But yeah, I think there was also a lot of exchange. And, it's interesting that going back to like some things were similar, that like, scientists would write each other letters, and there was a lot of, kind of communication. Obviously it looks different now, but yeah, I think that was, I think the idea that like across countries there were differences, but then there were still a lot of these kind of commonalities that happened.
And I do think that the Royal Society and other academic societies that were really important for distributing the information. They had positions called intelligenceers, which were basically people that their whole job was making sure that information moved between these scientists, right? It wasn't so instantaneous as we have now. So getting something written doesn't mean anyone's going to read it until you put it in front of them.
Right.
I'll mention there was, and bring in a little bit of some economics research on this period, that there's some really interesting research showing that like after World War I, so a little earlier, showing how that war impacted, diffusion of knowledge. Because you had these kind of more open connections before, and then there's some authors who kind of showed that basically when you had the World War I happen, the scientists kind of relied on knowledge from kind of the other side. They really suffered in terms of like their science, because they couldn't, access, and there was boycotting, right, of like the Allied versus the Central countries. And so I think this theme also of like how you can have kind of these institutions and science happening, and then if you have like a global, geopolitical shock, it can actually really change what kind of science is done.
Yeah, and then we get to World War II, and I recognize so much changed, and I'm just going to drop in a tie-in. It actually introduces a future character that you guys brought up in kind of the notes that I had to go dig into, because there's a tie-in with Nikola Tesla that comes to my mind instantaneously. I mean, yes, in his later years, he was a bit of a crank. He had like the death ray and all kinds of weird stuff, a practitioner of pseudoscience. Where I'm actually going is that when he died, the U.S. government confiscated his notes for national security purposes, just in case there was something that could fall into the Germans' hands. And actually, it was a Bush that actually got the hold of those notes and was the one that went through that. It's almost like that was a flag or a tell where things were actually going. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't know as much about the Tesla case that you mentioned, but one of the aspects that Vannevar Bush, who you're referring to, spoke a lot about, and ultimately was really important in these discussions as we're talking about active conflict, was that the science was being done to protect a nation or to gain an advantage in war, which meant that the exchange of information was not really existent, or it was existent only within the boundaries of select individuals in these governments. So afterwards, as we get out of World War II, a major aspect of where the focus is, okay, well, we've done all this work. When are we going to start sharing it externally? When are we going to make it more publicly accessible to those in our country? We know that international exchange is really important. Even though we've had to play it close to chest now, we ultimately have to move away from that if we want to be leaders in science. So that's part of the transition is ultimately this decision to go from sort of state secrets and closely guarded scientific information, which was make or break in World War II, to, maybe a more collaborative, productive, society-facing research enterprise.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that's right on. And I think, we'll get into this more, but I think with World War II, you had this, real change in kind of how governments thought about science. Because before, governments did fund some scientific work, but it wasn't really like a part of national security, right? And then obviously that changed a lot during the war. And so, Manhattan Project, obviously, but, you have all these other examples, radar, code breaking, all these things where it could really affect military outcomes. And so, I think this idea that governments became interested in whether these scientific ideas can actually have impact on security and strategy. And so I think that was like a change in the mindset. And so then, I think the big question becomes, and, we brought up Bush already a few times, but, what happens after the war? And so do you actually dismantle this big scientific enterprise? How does it look? What are the institutions that need to be created? And so, I think there was also this point of saying, you can't just create these institutions overnight. You have these top scientists, right? And talent that's contributing to these efforts, and you can't really do this right away. And so, if we want to get into it now, but, I think Bush, so Vannevar Bush was asked by President Roosevelt to think about this problem. And, Bush had the answer wrote about this in The Endless Frontier in 1945. And, I think it's interesting because that really became the kind of blueprint, the way forward for what science looked like in the U.S. And, at the same time, though, there was actually a debate. And so there was Harvey Kilgore, who was a senator from West Virginia, who chaired the subcommittee on war mobilization, but known as the Kilgore Committee. And there was a debate. They had different visions of what science would look like. And so Kilgore actually wanted a more centralized approach than Bush. And, it's interesting. He argued that funding should actually be distributed based on kind of geographic equity and, economic need, rather than just on kind of elitist institutional merit. And so, again, this would be a different path then. I mean, there's some of this that you can see kind of still was valued when and the way science developed. But I think that's, kind of interesting part of history. The other thing I think, related to what I work on is this, these lessons from the war on why talent was important, right? And so, if you think about many of the scientists who were involved in kind of wartime research, they were actually immigrants or refugees from Europe, right? And so there's an economist, Fabian Waldinger, who writes a lot about the Jewish emigres from Germany, and around World War II, and how they came to the U.S. and impacted science and innovation dramatically. And so you can really see that, policymakers are kind of seeing these things, right? You have the power of scientific research, and you also have the value of attracting scientific talent. And so I think that really is something that, was important for the development of U.S. science. And so actually going back to Tesla, your original, question, not really, I think, where you're going with this, but, he was an immigrant, right? He was born in what's today Croatia, arrived in 1884. So this was even happening prior, right, to World War II. But I think this question of how did the U.S. How was it able to attract talent, which I think was really a big part of where we are today.
Hi.
Absolutely. Sorry, if I could just chime in quickly. One of my favorite quotes from The Endless Frontier that ties directly to what you just said, Ina. So Bush talks a ton about scientists, about developing a scientific crop inside within the United States is his primary focus, but he does explicitly say the most important single factor in scientific and technical work is the quality of the personnel employed. And attracting and retaining talent was something that was very important to him. He talks a lot about making sure that the positions are well funded enough that folks don't go straight to industry, they don't get opportunities elsewhere, that they stay within the United States to do this work, so that if and when they produce something that's valuable or important for the state, productive for public health, it happens here first.
I kind of want to follow that up a little bit. I know we're already completely off track, but that's okay. It's whimsical for a reason. The war itself, it's almost like as a Western society, ended up training up a whole lot of more scientists, or was able to concentrate the talent in such a way that there was like perhaps a critical mass. All of a sudden, you had all of these wonderful people who had all these skills, and now they also needed to do something with these skills, right? So was it almost preordained that we had to change something or build something, because all of a sudden we have this critical mass of people with all this new talent and skills that have been trained up throughout the war?
And you're talking about particularly after World War II, yeah?
Like the whole process of like the whole war, it was like we need to solve all these problems and essentially win the war. And now we have all these people that are trained in a very specialist way. Now you have to find something for them to do almost, right? I mean, that's boiling it down to something a bit more basic than where I'm trying to go, but I think it still illustrates the point.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of this idea that, there's all these people. That's part of this big scientific machine, apparatus that was there. And so I think that was the debate, is like, what happens now? And so I guess it's true, like, what do you do with them? But there were all these investments, and there's great research by Dan Gross and Bhavan Sampat that looks at this period and also kind of how all those investments impacted innovation. And part of this is all the people who were involved, like what did they do after? And so, there was a lot more kind of, patenting and scientific, activity because of these investments. I think, you're right. It's because of also, the people, because they are needed to do that. So, but I don't know. Maybe Chris knows more about like whether that was part of the dialogue that Bush, had.
Yeah, so from my understanding, I think at this point, at least, at the highest levels of government, there was a pretty strong appreciation for the value of science, right? I mean, this conversation between FDR, or that started with FDR and ultimately led to the endless frontier, was recognizing the tremendous value provided by the work done both before and in World War II. So in addition to the fact that, we've already mentioned the Manhattan Project, we mentioned radar, which, by the way, is a fascinating story of, you almost call it like scientific warfare, where the German U-boats were particularly problematic in the Atlantic. It was a major problem. Radar comes along, gives the Allied forces an advantage. Then there is a technological development on the German side that makes it easy to detect when somebody is using radar. And then ultimately a brand new form of radar comes in that circumvents that as well. So in addition to that, there's a major emphasis on infectious diseases. That's also represented in the Endless Frontier. There is a huge drop between World War I and World War II in terms of deaths associated with infectious disease, both in the general population as well as in soldiers on the battlefront. That comes from transfusible blood plasma developments, the production of population quantities of antibiotics like penicillin, and also, importantly, development of insecticides like DDT to reduce insect-borne illnesses. So this gave a huge advantage, and it was ultimately in the context of the challenge of World War I, and the Spanish flu that was really a deciding factor in the war, at least played a role in it. How can we make sure that these infectious diseases don't change how the outcome of World War II plays out? So because there was this well-established value, I think, in the output of science, the focus wasn't so much on, we got to give these people something to do, but rather, hey, we need to make sure that in peacetime we can benefit from this in the same way. It's clear that if we provide the resources, we attract and develop the talent, they will produce. We don't necessarily know what the output will be. We don't know how the basic knowledge that they generate will translate to some kind of industrial development or public health development. But we know that if we do this enough, we will get those wins like we got in World War II. So, as I said, I think a lot of the focus is on, okay, hey, this was great. This has provided a huge benefit. The development also of the biomedical infrastructure between World War I and World War II played a huge role in this. We know this is important. How do we keep it going?
All right, I'm going to pivot back a little bit here. So we've kind of set up how we ended up with a significant amount of talent and the means to be able to support large scientific endeavors. But what about like pre-World War II in as far as those big state scientific endeavors? I can point at different things that have happened that were concerted efforts, but most of them weren't really led by the state, so to speak. I mean, one that comes to mind for me is like mapping the world. I don't know if I would necessarily call that true science, but science happens because of it. It was a state-sponsored thing to go around and map the world and find the new world and resources and the like. But was like the Manhattan Project and the space race really the first of their kind at that scale from the state specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's true. And I think Chris gave a great overview of some of these, kind of the earlier institutions. And so, as you said, you had governments that sponsored or states sponsored some of these large, technical or scientific projects. And so, you can even go back to like Greek city-states or Roman times. So you had kings who were inventing war machines and, the death ray, the famous death ray. So I think there were examples of these, but as you said, like mapping expeditions, that was, it's a good example of this where it's a big endeavor. And I actually want to bring in a little bit of economics if I can here, that this is what. Yeah, so economists point to this as kind of a classic public good. This issue around why do you need a government here? And so if you think about maps, you can also think about canals, railroads, public health systems, and going back to military projects. The state. Why does the state have to get involved? Well, what economists point to is that if you have something like those projects or knowledge, so we can shift to kind of think about basic science. Once it's created, you actually can't prevent people from benefiting from it, right? So once you have the map of the world, you can't really prevent people from like accessing that knowledge. And so the idea here is that like the social returns are much higher than the private ones. And so if you have any individual firm, or the private sector, they won't actually invest in those projects. So you need the government to step in. And so, as you said, like mapping is a great example. Like once you've mapped, or surveyed a territory, a lot of people can benefit from that information. So if we turn then to, basic scientific research, it's very similar. So you have like benefits, right, that are really widespread. And it's also unpredictable. And the benefits often come much later. And so that's what, Chris was talking about Bush and kind of that question around after World War II. We don't really know what's going to happen with the science that's being done. And eventually, maybe it'll lead to things that are going to be really useful, but we don't know. And so, I think that was actually Bush's like key insight, is that science is a public good. And so, industry alone is not going to invest in it. They will underinvest. And so you need, the government to step in. Now, I will say then that, Chris mentioned like radar, right, and all these other things that happened during World War II. And, the benefits were still, right, like benefiting from those things today. And so what economists call that is these positive spillovers, because like you have those investments, people working on it, and then we benefit from it today. Now, going back to what you said, like, so what about the Manhattan Project? What about the space race? Well, I think the Manhattan Project, like it was obviously really huge, right? But, the numbers aren't really, if you think about like how many people were working on it, right? How much was invested. But I think what's really unique was like also the fact that it was interdisciplinary and there was a lot of uncertainty. But what was striking about it was that it wasn't just about, trying to kind of advance the discipline, right? It was trying to solve like a specific challenge. So it was built around a problem, which actually the way science is done in most places today is not actually like that, right? Like very interdisciplinary. And so, I think the Manhattan Project, it was like, different because no one knew whether it could actually like, work out. And you had physicists, you had chemists, you had mathematicians, all these different people coming together at a scale that hadn't existed before. So I think, during wartime, you have this kind of push that, there's something even, bigger that's going on. I think the other thing that's interesting about it is that the concentration of talent, right? So you had so many leading scientists, and it was really something that can't happen automatically, right? It involved, institutions, funding, migration to happen too. And then you move to the space race where I think, a lot of what was learned from the Manhattan Project, kind of translated, but it became something permanent, right? So it wasn't, the Manhattan Project was something kind of temporary, right, during this crisis period. And now, obviously, then you go into kind of, the Cold War period, and you have, NASA and these standing institutions. And, obviously, like how that was able to happen given, kind of like the costs associated with it. Obviously, there was like a political aspect to it that maybe we can return to. But I think that, kind of transition to kind of again permanence is interesting.
Yeah,
Let's go.
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, let's go to that debate. I mean, that seems, we've already kind of talked about it. I know very little about it. You mentioned that we have Vannevar Bush and Kilgore. So, I mean, that debate is the way the space race or those institutions became permanent. So...
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to leave it. I was just, go. Just go. I don't know much about
Sorry,
this.
I love this conversation and talking about this debate because the setup of the National Science Foundation through the NSF Act is really where the foundation of the modern U.S. science apparatus starts. So this debate was about, how do we go about that? Bush had his very clear vision, which he laid out in the Endless Frontier, focused largely on scientific autonomy, attraction and retention of talent, letting science basically run its own course and in time trust that there will be valuable output. He was extremely concerned with, as Ina mentioned, extremely concerned with focusing too much on very sort of specific directions, whether that came from industrial players that had like a commercial needed to create immediate profit, or if that was even coming from political figures who wanted certain things to be focused and not others. So he ultimately really wanted the science to be the core focus and let the scientists steer the ship. The vision of Kilgore, which makes sense in the context of the time. He was from West Virginia. He was one of the New Deal senators. His focus was largely on, okay, well, if we believe in science has value, it should be value for the public. So if it's value for the public should have some say in how what science gets done and how it gets articulated. So there was one of the core differences was this idea of, okay, who makes these funding decisions? Of course, on the Bush side, it was the scientists, the experts, and basically in a peer review process, whereas Kilgore wanted scientists to be a major voice in that room. But there was sort of a committee structure where there would be members of the general public in some cases. There would also be political appointees. It would be steered by a director who would be appointed, I believe, by the president. So, the vision there, at least from his point of view, was, well, we don't want to just have these scientists go do their interesting things that they're focused on. We need to make sure that it benefits the general public. So it fits into that dynamic of New Deal politics and where the Senate and really where Congress was at the time.
I'm going to make a very, very crass observation. Keep in mind, and I'm a Canadian, it just seems to boil down of one was pro-regulation and one was not.
Yes and no. I mean, I think, again, what's interesting, I think, about this debate, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Ina, is that the operation that they were focused on, right, this idea of public and political players being involved or not purely sort of scientific effort, the reasons for that and the justification for that have really kind of changed over time. And what I mean by that is that what Bush was concerned with wasn't necessarily what I would say scientists are concerned with now in today's world, of there being more and more political control and a fear of sort of shifting things in a direction that doesn't necessarily serve the evidence and the science. So anyways, I find this conversation really interesting because Kilgore's perspective and the perspective of those who supported him has merit, right? Like one of the big issues that we have right now, and that maybe even contributed to the position that the U.S. is in, is that there isn't a lot of dialogue between science and the public. The public benefits from science, the public pays for the science, but there's not necessarily a lot of view into how the sausage is made or dialogue between the two. One of my favorite stats, I pulled this from a survey once, is that the average member of the U.S. public knows significantly more fictional scientists than they do real ones. To me, that's a big, big problem.
What? Really?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, this is one survey. I think it was a sample size of about 1,000. But the idea is that like the general interactions of the scientific community are relatively insular. We go to our meetings, we hang out at our universities and have these conversations, whereas the public doesn't necessarily get to be involved in those conversations. Another good example, look at how we publish science. A lot of it ends up behind paywalls or ends up in places where it's really difficult to understand and access. So it means that over time, as we become more specialized, that the separation between the two has really grown. So now, as we're seeing changes in how the government perceives the value of science and how it should be done, we don't necessarily have maybe as much public support as we could, simply because they don't have as good of an insight into who we are, how we operate, and how that work has benefited them over decades of contributions.
This is reminding me of, this is all really fascinating. But I don't know if you have heard about the Golden Fleece Award, which is, I had to look it up again, but it's in like the 1970s, the senator from Wisconsin would basically give an award to essentially like the science that was like kind of the most ridiculous or something like that. And so anyway, but it reminds me a little bit of these kind of like, if you just kind of look at projects that are funded by the NSF, it's hard for people to understand, like, why should we be investing in these projects, right? Like and there's so many of these famous examples. They sound ridiculous. And then actually it turns out like, though that research was like critical, right, to like some advance in health. And so it's, I think what Chris was saying that, it's like, it's hard sometimes to, you want the public to be involved in these things and to, kind of have a voice. But then, I think it's hard to kind of have those connections happen. And I think this also goes back to what we were talking about with like, why the government needs to invest in science, and how do you actually measure the benefits? Well, it's really hard to measure long run benefits. So I know that there's been a lot of effort by policymakers, economists to try to like look at like NSF grants, like what are the returns to those investments to the government and the society? Well, how do you measure that, right? It's very difficult to think about like everything that came out of like this one NSF grant. Well, there could be related things that have discoveries, right? Or it's how do you kind of track like what's the paper trail to measure that? And I think that's where, if you think about what politicians worry about, like their voters, they want to know what the benefits are. And so I think we're in this period now again of like where there's kind of reflection on like how do we actually measure those benefits and how can we show the public that it's useful to invest in this kind of research.
So I just want to get back to, so how did the frontier, the ideas that were put out in that book end up winning the day? We've kind of missed that part of the question. And then we're already kind of talking about it. So how does that then hook up with the social contract between scientists and what the state actually looks like? What's expected of both sides? So I guess first, how did the Bush idea end up winning the day? Like, how did that debate kind of crystallize into what we have?
I think obviously a lot of things go into how folks end up voting and how these bills end up being drawn up. From my perspective, I do think that there was a significant respect for Bush and his office and the success that it had brought in World War II. So that carried a lot of weight in this conversation. So you've got this scientist who is plugged into the levers of power in D.C., that understands who he needs to be talking to, has built up these relationships over many years, has all of these different massive successes that can be pointed to say, hey, I know how this should be done. And ultimately how it should be successful. And it's also important to note that the endless frontier, yes, it was articulated by Bush, but behind the scenes, he ran multiple committees with countless other experts that provided sub-reports that then informed his larger strategy. So there was already, I think, a critical mass amongst leadership and science to back this proposal. So from my point of view, how influential Bush was and really his connection with both science, the scientific community, and with government is at least a key part in how that viewpoint won out. Whereas, again, Kilgore, influential politician, a senator, but not necessarily a scientist equipped to talk about, how things should be done. And honestly, maybe we'll talk about this later, but that reflects an interesting change in maybe even public attitude towards science and sort of rising anti-intellectualism. I think at the time there was much more respect, especially within government, for what intellectual sort of science-facing people brought to the table. Whereas now there is increasingly more, what do you ever want to call it, sort of skeptical folks that are skeptical of science, that have viewpoints that are more pseudoscience, and that is also better reflected in the folks that represent them in government, which was not the case necessarily then.
So we have the debate. Now we have kind of like a social contract built between the state, the scientists, and the public. What was actually that look like? What was expected on both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I could start. I think Chris, maybe could fill in some of the institutional details. But, the way that I think I was thinking about this is that, between kind of scientists and society, there was a bit of kind of like a bargaining, right? So yeah, this contract was that, you have these institutions that, were created after the end of the World War II. And essentially the government kind of, agreed to provide long-term support for research, significant amounts of it, and with relatively few strings attached. So Chris talked about autonomy, right, and kind of these other aspects of kind of the Bush's approach. And in return, scientists were expected to generate knowledge that would then contribute to national security, right, economic growth, public health, and like social progress. And so I think one thing that I've been reflecting on, also seeing kind of changes in the last year or so, right, is like how much trust there was in the system, right? And so if you think about on the policymaker side, they were willing to kind of, fund research without exactly knowing what the payoffs were going to be. So going back to like, what are the benefits, right? And so, again, kind of giving grants to researchers who are doing, basic science or, even applied work that they don't really know if there's going to be a return. And so, there wasn't really even, I don't know if we've talked yet about 1980 and the Bayh-Dole Act, but, prior to that, right, there was like, again, very little prospect of commercial impact. Faculty at universities weren't really patenting, but, based on research that was funded by federal funds. And so, again, going back to this idea that there was this understanding that basic research was a public good, there didn't have to be a commercial impact. And so, I think this idea that like the scientists, could kind of do what they thought was kind of the most beneficial from a scientific perspective. Now, and I think this is this kind of feature of the post-war contract, which is autonomy. And so government funded science, but they didn't really dictate every research question. Now, I also think then, the social contract is also about talent. And so, we talked earlier about, kind of thinking about the U.S. becoming, and Chris mentioned Bush also talked about this, like being open to scientists and students coming from around the world, right? And so the importance of like attracting talent, a big part of that, and actually I have some work right now looking at the importance of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which was like just, around the time of Civil Rights Act. President Kennedy was really pushing for this. But if you look at how, science developed and kind of who the scientists were, it really changed a lot in that time because you had a lot of international students coming to do PhDs in the U.S., staying and, having their careers here, but also scientists coming. If you look at data on like Nobel Prize winners, right? Like, a lot of Nobel Prize winners did their prize winning work in the U.S., but actually like were born in other countries, right? So again, this idea that immigration is a big part of the story. And also, Chris mentioned there was also a lot of investment in universities, right? And so training talent. And so those became the places where you had training happening and the science happening and, had very open institutions. And so I think, this question today about like, are we revisiting that social contract? I think there's a lot more pressure on scientists, on universities to really show what the returns are. What are they producing? How is that impacting the economy? And I think, that kind of departs a bit from Bush's vision, which was that society really has to invest in research because of these long-run benefits that are really large, even if you can't predict them. And so, again, I think there's this challenge right now of like, how do we balance this of like showing that it's useful and it's helping the economy when a lot of the research that's being done that needs, that previously it was funded, we, don't know what's going to happen. And I think also with talent, right? We are in this period of potentially like restricting talent that comes to the U.S. And so, we're in a system where like I think over 30% of PhDs awarded in the U.S. Are international
30%.
Yeah, and even
Wow.
in some fields, it's even more. So I think computer science, it's like, seen like 60%. So, and you think about, these fields that are really critical in terms of like, innovation happening. And so, science is so international. And so kind of what happens if you start to, some of the policies that are being discussed about kind of shortening the length of the PhD if you're, for citizens or, other policies that could change things a lot.
Yeah, and just on that point too, obviously, as we've already sort of alluded to, a lot of science policy changes have happened in the last year and a half in the United States. But one of them on that point about sort of homegrown U.S. citizen talent versus attracting talent from elsewhere, there's also been destabilization of the existing policies that support homegrown scientists, right? So a very good example is the NSF's graduate student research fellowship program. So as of very recently, the number of awards that have been given out has dropped significantly. I believe the past year it was about half. I think the administration then ultimately revised that and added a few hundred more. But the point stands that between 2024 and 2025, the number of U.S. citizens receiving this award, those are only people that are eligible for it, has dropped. But amazingly, if we're talking about how do we prove value in these types of things, that fellowship, which was a part of the NSF from the very early days, was responsible for producing, if I'm not mistaken, I think about 50 Nobel laureates, or at least they were supported in part by that program, right? So that shows just how valuable that program is if we do it. So why cut the numbers? If we're concerned about increasing representation of U.S. citizens in our own science, sort of why destabilize one of the few programs that really does that quite well?
Okay, just because I could keep you guys here and talk about this forever. But I'm going to have to skip a couple of questions because we're jumping around, which is fantastic. But also, we're quickly shifting in our discussion towards the present. And I still think we need to hit one kind of shift that kind of happened, I guess, in the late 70s or into 80s, although I think you guys will get into it and tell me that I'm wrong and it goes further back than that. But like how we changed in the viewing of ownership of scientific discovery. Because there was a point somewhere along in the 80s, or at least I recognized it a bit more in the 90s, where it became controlled a bit more by corporations. And you started to have even science fiction put corporations as governments and stuff like this in the far future. So there was definitely a shift that was happening, wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about one piece that I'm a bit more familiar with.
Well, I think you've already mentioned the act as well, right? In the same time frame.
That's what I was gonna maybe touch on, is that kind of a real turning point that a lot of economists have also studied kind of the impacts of this was the Bayh-Dole Act, which was in 1980. And so that was essentially a law that allowed universities, faculties, members who are working on research that kind of has commercial potential to patent and license inventions that arose from, and the key is from, federally funded research. And so before that, the federal government really retained the rights, the IP. And, you hear in these stories that there were kind of all these really promising discoveries that were kind of like sitting on dusty shelves, right? That nothing ever happened with. And so, the goal then was to really make it easier to move these discoveries from laboratory into commercial products. And yeah, it's interesting because it was, Bayh and Dole. And so, there was this, bipartisan effort. And Bayh actually, I think the story but I think that his wife had, a form of cancer, had a health issue, and essentially, there was no therapeutic, there was nothing that was developed because it hadn't, there was research that had been promising that wasn't commercialized. Maybe Chris knows the story better, but yeah. So I think this idea that how can we actually get this science kind of into helping society was a goal, and so there's been research that's kind of looked at this shift and, what as faculty started to kind of commercialize more. And actually the NSF has its own program, which I'm involved a little bit in evaluation of, which is it's called the NSF encore program. So it's actually something that is funded by the NSF to try to train. It's like an entrepreneurship training program. So you take faculty at universities and, how do you get them thinking about the market, for their research? What would be the product that would be developed? And so, but I think that shift, was really in the 80s.
No, I think you nailed it. The only piece I would add to it is also, I believe it's in 1981, but there's a major shift in tax structure as well. That there was the addition of basically like making investments by companies and by corporations into research and development, something that they could ultimately deduct. So that shift, being able to make those expenses something that was not necessarily like purely out of pocket, coming purely out of their profits, they could instead shift it from their total revenue. So yeah, I mean, I think those two things together, in addition to the fact that although the total research dollars coming from the Fed continued to rise, the proportion relative to economic output continued to drop throughout this period. So as the federal government is taking less and less ownership of how research is done, you're seeing these policy and law changes in policy and law that are encouraging investment from industry into science. And by and large, I think that's a great thing. It's led to a lot of valuable products. Certainly, you see a surge in things like pharmaceutical companies and diagnostic companies after this period. But yeah, I would say, as Ina mentioned, the early 1980s was a point where the emphasis was how can we make science more commercial. Even, it's a double-edged sword, certainly, but that was really where they were focused.
So then how does that, knock-on effects to other parts of the scientific apparatus? I mean, NASA is famous for letting all of their patents go straight to the public. And so now you have these institutions that are trying to potentially, commercialize those patents. So was there like knock-on effects throughout the apparatus?
Well, what I would say is that starting in this period and continuing until now, because of that point of emphasis, how do we make the research that we're doing valuable to the public or valuable to some kind of commercial enterprise? You see less and less interest in necessarily funding higher risk, more basic research programs. So instead, the emphasis becomes, what's the long tail view of this research? What is the immediate impact? How fast will we be able to get there? And then work that is a little bit more explorational, that doesn't necessarily have like a direct line to some kind of commercial value, becomes less and less emphasized. Now, granted, there have been changes also in certain grants that were created to help avoid that or reinvest in basic research in a traditional sense. But I think really that change in attitude continued to seep into these agencies that are run by the federal government and put more and more pressure on scientists to be, how do we make your work as productive as possible? So I would say maybe that's the kind of the through line, is that these changes in policy precipitated a general attitude of how do we make research immediately more valuable to the public.
Okay, so just before we get to the present day, I'm in Canada. I'm not in the U.S. Europe, did they have the same kind of shift towards more corporate entities and trying to make sure that, these things became quicker to market and to add to the citizens of the country? Or was it really just follow the leader from the States? Like, how did that all come to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I wouldn't say that Europe and Canada just followed the U.S. I mean, I think, I'm in Europe right now, in France. And yeah, I mean, I think there is this idea of, similar ideas that you want, the public, the government wants to see the benefits of what they're investing in. But I would say, my sense is that Canada, Europe for sure is Europe has placed more emphasis on kind of publicly funded science and kind of less pressure on universities to patent discoveries or create startups compared to the U.S. And if you look at kind of innovative activities and entrepreneurship startups. I mean, there's really great examples from Europe, but if you look at, people always say, if you just look at MIT and like kind of Kendall Square, like there's like so much activity there compared to kind of, if you look at a typical kind of, country in over here. And so, I think just this idea that the U.S. is much more kind of innovative and has a lot more of this commercialization. But yeah, I mean, I think this is where I think kind of back to this, I keep bringing this up, but I think this is, problem that countries are trying to solve, which is like, how do you preserve science as a public good while also turning these discoveries into, economic and social benefits. So, and I will mention, just one thing that came to mind when Chris was was speaking just now, and then you mentioned, about NASA giving away patents, and there was such an interesting study that this economist Heidi Williams did of looking at Celera and like when kind of the Human Genome Project, and this was like like a big effort, right? International effort. And you had kind of this interesting, economist level, what we call natural experiment. So you had kind of this, private, effort to try to do this. And then you also have the public effort. And what Heidi was able to show is that it's a bit random of like which genes were, kind of ended up being discovered. And so you had patents on the private ones and not on the public ones. And then she could follow what happened. And I think this idea, what came out of that work, and there's been kind of follow up too, and it's a bit more nuanced, but the idea that if you have, the public has access to this information and it's not patented, then you're going to get more follow-on innovation. And so, and I haven't seen a study on NASA's. Maybe it's a good topic for a PhD student in economics to pursue. But I think that's something we're still learning about because, this thing, we didn't get into it. We didn't have time today, but patents, are they good or bad? That's a big question, right? Of you need incentives for people to invest into that, R&D. And if you don't have a patent, then people may not do it. But then, this tension, then it's also, you're not kind of giving access to that discovery to other people. So anyway, I think that's a topic for another session.
Yeah, it's a whole can of worms. But I think we've kind of arrived at the present. And gosh, I got to tell you, when I look south, I'm like, holy smokes, what is going on? How much change can one country do in just 2 years? So, I wrote this question originally, but I don't even know where to take it. I feel like I'm pretty information dense. I take in a lot of information, but I don't even know how to process what's these ramifications going on. Because even if you switch the policy 180 degrees, you can't go back to what it was. It's not that simple. So I don't know. I'm just going to leave it there and leave it to you guys.
Yeah, boy, is it hard to summarize the scale and scope of recent changes to U.S. science policy. I mean, that obviously what you're describing is kind of across the government, but sticking to our areas of expertise, it's been a whirlwind. I've been maintaining this tracker for my company that basically just pulls articles about different changes so that I can have it all in one place. And just after a year and a half, it's a really long document. Some things are more minor, some things are massive changes. But I would say, to your point, one of the most important points of discussion in a general sense is that science relies on stability and reliable infrastructure to continue to produce discoveries that then lead to innovations. So as you do these mass shifts, as you change things dramatically from how they've been done and how they've been productive, that destabilization in and of itself puts the infrastructure and the enterprise at risk. So even if some of these policies, have a rosy end, how they're being rolled out and ultimately the lack of scientific input on how these are being developed and rolled out is a big part of the problem. Just quickly, we've seen grant terminations, freezes in delivery of grant funds, including some that support clinical trials and longitudinal studies. There have been massive personnel cuts to scientific agencies and including government scientists. There's certainly an effort to have more tighter, centralized political control over both the work being done at some of these agencies as well as their ability to communicate externally. I mentioned the NSF GRFP cuts, and maybe today the I think where most people are focused is again that additional layers of political oversight, especially on grant funding decisions. There's been a lot of discussion about a recently proposed rule by the Office of Management and Budget to effectively set aside scientist-led decision-making in the funding of scientific research. So instead of it being peers evaluating the work and deciding who gets funded, ultimately those folks would shift to more of an advisory role, and then a political appointee would be responsible for making those decisions. that also goes as far to include how their ability to use those funds to publish science, the ability to travel for conferences. It just injects as I said, a layer of political influence into the process. And yeah, a lot of people are very concerned about what that means because of what we've described in this episode. That is fundamentally not how science has been done in the United States up until now.
Yeah, and to put, I guess, a labor and economic point on it, it must be, I assume, going to be harder to retain and attract new talent.
Right. No, and that's exactly, I think that's where, we talked already a little bit about immigration, right? And so this idea of attracting talent, but that's, thinking about global talent. But, I think I'm going to pick up on what Chris was talking about with what's happened, in terms of government agencies. And so we didn't really get to talk much about, after World War II, that you had kind of the role of a government scientist, right? And it became a really attractive career path, right? And so you had these agencies, right? NASA, EPA, NIH, and you had government scientists, really, talented individuals who, wanted to come to work for these agencies, because there were these also, mission-driven agencies. And, we think about the scientific workforce, often we focus on universities often, but really within the government, you have so much, kind of in terms of science being produced and these career paths. And so now when we're in this period where what Chris was talking about, where you have, workforce reductions, you have all, going back to the Mertonian norms, some of these things around community and, going to conferences or, autonomy, those have also changed. And so it really raises, I think, long-term questions about the long term, whether, the government will be able to attract talent, right? So given that there is this now uncertainty and the trust is kind of, maybe been eroded, will people see these institutions as desirable places to build careers? And, this is true also for economists, right? It's like we have a lot of PhD economists would also go work for government institutions. And so, I think we all have stories we know of people who've kind of gone through this and are, aren't sure about whether even in the future they're going to want to work for the government. So, and even we can go back to the Manhattan Project, we talked about a lot, but what if all the, Oppenheimer, Feynman, Fermi, what if they didn't want to be involved, right? So then that becomes a question. If you don't have the talent wanting to be a part of it, what does that mean?
Yeah, and just to add to that, what would have happened if folks like Einstein didn't feel safe to emigrate into the United States? Would they have gone somewhere else? Would the Manhattan Project have been missing key players that ultimately led to the success of the project? So, yeah, I mean, as Ina said, I think the immigration story here is a huge part of the problem. The United States has benefited. Its point of leadership is not just the output of the science, but it is also that the United States in the last 50 years has been kind of the place to do the research, the place to come to conferences and to meet other scientists. And also to get their education. Maybe they go home. Maybe they go back to China. They go back to Sweden. But they might have gotten their graduate schooling done in the United States. They may have done a postdoc here. So if we start to dial that back down, how does that trickle down to the folks, everyone else in the United States that has benefited maybe quietly from the work of all of these immigrants?
For sure. I do want to touch on one more thing before we get to call-outs and the infamous last question. I've had to skip over a lot because you guys are so fascinating, and I keep learning more and more things. But there's this last question I really want to touch on. And I get it. You guys have definitely made the case today that science is always, at least how we conduct it, how we build it within a state or an institution is political. But it was also became like the literal backbone of law and regulation. I mean, we didn't get the time to talk about it, but the Clean Air Act, EPA's founding. So I guess, are we kind of reaping the reaper's harvest at this point? Because that kind of made science political, or at least the scientist in absentia, because we are not very good talkers, political as like an entity, because government does it. To some individuals, it can't be trusted. Like, is that kind of where we're in today? Is that kind of a one way to sum it up?
Chris? Yeah.
Huge question.
I know. I saved the worst for last. I'm sorry.
No, it's a great question. I think I would actually argue, and I have many times at this point, that, as you said, science is inherently political. If it depends on the function of the government, it depends on politics. And U.S. science has, for decades, enjoyed bipartisan support, and that led to all of these things that we've discussed, and that's great. As that shifts, now suddenly we're realizing the fact that this is because the scientists themselves are not necessarily as equipped to maybe do the advocacy. They're not close enough to the levers of power. Maybe they're not as good at organizing. Now that there is less sort of well-established, trusted support, the scientists were sort of caught. I would say U.S. scientists were caught flat-footed. We're surprised by a lot of these changes. So where I say I disagree some is just to say that I think that because science has always had this or modern science has always had this political connection, that we need to do better to actually be a part of those conversations. Things like, there are policy fellowships, that help support scientists and get them into roles of established roles in government. I'd love to see more representation of scientists in actual elected positions. I would say that increasing the amount of political activity for scientists is a good thing. That may not necessarily be very partisan. It may be focused on specific issues of expertise, but I think the time may have passed where we can just trust that the government and maybe also to some extent the public will continue to foot the bill without us necessarily having to keep them along for the ride.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I'll just add, I guess one thing that I was thinking about, because I think this is a great question, is, it's whether science is political or that it's politically consequential. And so, if you think about, like you mentioned, Clean Air Act, and you think about, kind of other ways that we turn to scientists to provide us like with evidence to make policy decisions, I think that's something that I hope will continue. And I think this is where, if we think about, even the Manhattan Project, right? Like scientists made that possible, right? The atomic bomb, but scientists didn't decide to build it, fund it, or use it. So those are political or military decisions and not clear if it was good for society, right? But I think there's kind of distinction between, there's the science and, for example, like telling us whether a pollutant is going to increase health risks, but then it's up to, society and our politicians, and, policymakers to kind of then think about how much, regulation should there be, right? And so I think it's nuanced. And so I don't know, I think we're entering a period for all the reasons that, we've discussed already and Chris was pointing to, where now whether there's trust in those institutions to use the science, I think that's kind of a question. And, I think this is where, kind of whether we're going to kind of continue to have these institutions like peer review, application, thinking about, vaccine research, effective, whether the evidence can, we're going to have institutions that can actually like help us get the right scientific evidence that kind of helps with the policy decisions. And, and then just like going back to like something that we started with too, of like thinking about what I've seen in different places, right? So like going back to Tajikistan or former Soviet countries, I really think like, scientific institutions seem to be most effective when they're open and independent, right? And so that I think is the question now. If we need credible science, are we going to be able to have those institutions remain that are going to be open and independent? So let's see. I'm optimistic still that we will make it through, but let's see.
Yeah, me too. I think steeling yourself from doom is one of the most important things that we can do right now, and remain focused on, how can we continue to do science and maybe protect what remains of successful policy. So I mean, I like I said, I think it's important that I'll say this obviously as a communicator, very self-serving, but I think a groundswell of empathetic scientific communicators can go a long way towards having these individual conversations with members of the public. And if everyone is able to influence a small number of people to support these policies or learn even a bit about the evidence that goes behind them, I think we will ultimately be much better off. Sure, it would have been better that we did more of that 20 years ago. Maybe our circumstance now would be different. But, maybe what's the old saying? The best time to start was yesterday. The next best time to start is today. And I think that's really where I try to encourage folks.
Perfect. That's a great place to end the main part of the interview on a positive note. I always prefer that to the doomsayers because then we get stuck and we don't do anything. So now it's time for call-outs. And this is just an opportunity to call out past colleagues, future work, something you read the other day that you thought everyone should hear. Really anything at all. And you could have nothing to call out at this moment because you've talked too much because I've already had you for over an hour.
I think I'm good.
Maybe I'll just say one that relates very closely to our discussion today. Go read The Endless Frontier. It's not a particularly long or dense text. Not every single aspect of it was turned into policy, but it does lay, I think, a view of how science and government can work together productively. And I think folks will find themselves, scientists especially, just kind of nodding along the way. I would say this has been a core focus of the discussion, so go check it out.
Awesome. Now, it's time for the infamous last question. Who wants to go first? Who wants to tell their favorite science joke? No volunteers? Do I have to pick?
All right, I'll do it. Hopefully the delivery is good enough and it's not just me thinking that this is funny. So
no. The worse the delivery, the better. That's the more groaning, the better.
Good. Okay. So really, this is maybe dad jokes, which I'm becoming more and more good at. Yes. Okay. So this is one I came across recently, and I really love it. Darwin counted finches, and Mendel counted peas. Watson and Crick counted on Rosalind Franklin.
I like that. Okay. Should I go?
You go for it.
All right. So this one actually came in handy very recently. My 10-year-old had his first kind of introduction in his science class to the particle theory of matter. So here we go. Why should you never trust an atom? They make up everything.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for being on. This was amazing.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here. Yeah, I learned a lot. It's great.
Likewise.
And that's an episode that is in the books. Definitely the longest one I've ever put out, so I'm going to keep this real brief. We've only got 2 more episodes left of season 2, and then we'll be taking a bit of a break until September. So thanks for sticking with us. And if you liked it, leave a review. Reviews are really important to the show and getting it out there to other people. Stay tuned because the next 2 episodes you definitely don't want to miss.
In a world so chaotic, so misbehaved, echoes of melodies remind us it's all waves. Colors weave stories painting the sky, swaying to rhythms as the galaxies fly by.